Rich countries meet only 4% of funds East Africa needs to address climate change. Now, this is according to a report compiled by Oxfam together with the Inter-Governmental Authority on Development-IGAD. The report indicates that East African countries collectively contribute a tiny 0.09% of the global carbon emissions, but are some of the worst hit by the global climate crisis. Appeals for humanitarian assistance doubled from $3.1 billion to $6.1 billion during the 2021-2023 hunger crisis, yet funding consistently fell short, with less than half of the requested resources delivered in most years. The report comes ahead of the Second African Climate Summit in Addis-Ababa, Ethiopia. Now, joining us to discuss the report is Oxfam Africa Climate lead David Abudho. Good afternoon, David. Thank you very much for joining us on the program. Now, you have released a report essentially confirming the long-standing concern by African nations that most industrialized and big polluters at that are not pledging substantial financial support to Africa to address the needs of climate change. Just talk us through that report.
Indeed, thank you for having me and the opportunity to share the findings of this report with our dear listeners. The report in itself is very shocking. So the major highlight of it is that in the case of the East African countries, the 8 of them, that is Eritrea, Djibouti, Somalia, Ethiopia, South Sudan, Sudan, Kenya, and Uganda, within the last 10 years, so 2013 to 2022, when the data is available, we have realized that they only received 4% of the climate finance that they need to meet their needs. That is, when you look at the needs that they've costed that require external financing, only 4% can be met by the inflows that are coming to that region. This is scandalous, especially if you consider that the region bears some of the worst, climate-induced crises, and which is not, sadly, is not of the making of the people who live in those contexts. Our report shows, for example, that only 1.7 billion is being availed against a need of 41.8 billion. So rich polluting nations, which continue to pollute, are not meeting their end of the bargain of providing climate finance, which is in line with the international commitment. So they're binding commitments that they've agreed that they will provide climate financing to help countries worst hit to cope, to adapt, to mitigate, and deal with the impact of the climate crisis. This is very shocking and indeed very scandalous.
No, indeed quite scandalous, because it's 96% short of what is actually needed, only 4% being contributed. But what has the report indicated around the reasons why these rich polluting nations have been unable to actually commit to financial assistance?
So one of the other problem, one of the highlights of the report is that the funding inflows, what comes as climate finance, 46% of it comes in form of loans. Again, these countries are struggling, they're weighed down by multiple crises. So if you add on the debt burden, then surely they cannot even meet the basic needs of the population living in those areas. So this, in a way, also complicated. Take the case of Eritrea and Somalia. The data shows that only 1% and 2% respectively of their climate finance, when you look at the costed needs in their NDCs, in national determined contributions, what they've calculated as the needs that require financing, against what they get, only 1% in the case of Eritrea and 2% in the case of Somalia. These countries are struggling with multiple crises. So fragile contexts are left behind in the conversation on climate change and financing for climate justice. So if you look at the issue, so one of the problems we have with the findings, or what we are agitating for, is that rich nations, rich polluting nations, have an obligation. They have signed up to it, and it's our responsibility to hold them to account for it. If you look at the injustice of not availing climate finance, and you look at the case of the 8 countries, for instance, 126 million people, 126.7 million people within the IGAD region, which represent 40% of the population, do not have access to clean water. They live in some of the worst, climate-induced conditions in Africa and indeed in the world. And yet, as you rightly point out, Africa is not responsible for the cause of climate change. Africa is not responsible for the problem. Africa only contributes 0.09, which is negligible. And yet we carry this burden. Rich polluting nations continue on this trajectory, on this path, which continues to pollute the world and which has brought us to where we are. And yet they do not want to share proportionately in shouldering this burden. So one of the other highlights from this report again is that if you break down the numbers, you realize that what Africa needs and what those regions need in terms of adaptation, for example, the funding for adaptation is completely inadequate. You've alluded to the humanitarian response. Data right now shows that 63.3 million people in 7 of those 8 countries are food insecure. And all this can be traced to the climate crisis. The climate crisis that intersects with other crises such as conflict and fragility and simply makes the life of people unbearable. What we are saying is that the demand for climate finance, it's not charity. Climate finance is not charity. Indeed, it's an obligation, it's a commitment that they have signed up to, and we must call on them to pay up so that countries handling this burden can adapt, mitigate, and responsibly and in a sustainable way transition to a path that utilizes renewable energies and that moves away from fossil fuel, which is the primary cause of the problem that we are facing right now. And this conversation
that you raised there, many would probably agree that the perception or wrong narrative must be corrected around climate change pledges, which, as you say, it's not a charitable thing or goodwill on their part, but it's an obligation, given that when you speak of the countries here, the highly industrialized nations are the ones who have an obligation because they have been the rich polluting nations that essentially set the planet on fire, and they must now alleviate the pressure on nations that have played a very nominal role on the continent. But unfortunately, we have run out of time, David. Thank you very much for joining us on the program. That's Oxfam Africa's climate lead, David Abudho, talking to us there following the release of their report around assistance, whether it should be grants or loans in that respect.